Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Rhea, and I wanted to welcome everyone to the Infinity Workforce Solutions Fast Forward Expert Roundtable and Information Exchange this morning. Before we get started, if you don't mind, open up your chat. Tell me who you are. Tell me where you're calling in from. I know we've got a lot of existing clients. I want to say hello to everyone. We've got a tremendous program this morning. Special guest, subject matter expert, and voice of our industry, Mr. Brandon Wiseman with TruckSafe.com will be updating us on what we can expect with the upcoming changes in the SMS and the CSA program. So I know you're going to want to make sure to take close notes because that impacts all of us. I also wanted to remind everyone next week is International Road Check with an emphasis on anti-brake systems and cargo securement, along with hours of service and medical cards and all the other things they're going to check for. And we certainly want to support our enforcement partners, CVSA, in this most important initiative. And also, I'd like to offer anyone that's not a subscriber to get a free demo. You can, if we've got the pop-up here, if you want a demonstration on our system, I did want to make sure you know we have some new content on anti-brake systems, brand new, right off the shelf. We're going to include a link to that content with a follow-up email. But if you want to get your drivers up to snuff on ABS, you can do that this afternoon. If you're an existing client, get that content out and signed, or if you want to sign up for the demonstration, I'm sure your customer service representative can get you up and going and get some content out to prepare our drivers and support our enforcement partners in next week's International Road Check. So if you want a demo, just check the yes. We'll give you another chance at the end of the session. But I wanted to get that out front and remind everybody that next week is International Road Check. Huge industry-based initiative that's been very successful. So with all that said, we've got a lot of people signed in, and let's get started. Today's subject again is SMS, Safety Management Systems, and the CSA, Compliance, Safety, Accountability programs, and what to expect on upcoming changes. Mr. Wiseman has been involved in some of the discussions on these changes. He supports these changes. I don't have to remind everybody the amount of resources our industry has invested in CSA. The metrics are used by carriers, shippers, drivers, insurance companies, and yes, plaintiffs' attorneys tend to use this as needed in their cases against us. So very important information. CSA was rolled out 10 or 11 years ago. I can certainly attest to the resources and the anxiety that went along with that rollout. We've got some time. We made a few adjustments. It's designed to improve highway safety through comparative metrics for commercial vehicles, through data obtained through roadside inspections, which we can expect a heavy presence on our highways next week from our enforcement officers with International Road Check coming up. So with that being said, we've got Mr. Brandon Wiseman. Again, I want to make sure he is a voice of our industry. He supports all of our efforts. He understands our industry insides and out, the legality of that. He's an attorney, but more than that, I think he just understands the reality of our industry. Brandon, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks to Infinity for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who's joining us this morning and spending some of your time talking about the riveting topic of the safety measurement system. It's an important topic, one that we have to discuss, because if you are a regulated carrier, as Mark hinted at, and as you know, the safety measurement system is a huge issue for you as a regulated carrier. It impacts you in many ways. Mark listed a few of them. It can impact your commercial auto liability insurance premiums if your scores aren't up to snuff. It can keep you from doing business with the shippers and the brokers that you want to do business with, because a lot of them are looking at your scores through the system to see how you are performing from a compliance standpoint. So if your scores start to trend in the wrong direction, you very well could find yourself losing business because of it. And most importantly of all, as Mark said, it is used by plaintiffs' attorneys in the context of highway accident litigation. It is used to paint you as a bad actor. It is used to demonstrate to the jury that you don't care about safety. Whether that data actually supports that or not, it will be used in that way. And so it is important, it is critical for motor carriers to keep an eye on their CSA scores and do everything in their power to improve those scores over time. And so the reason it is particularly important that we talk about this topic today is because the system as we know it and as we have known it since 2010 will be undergoing some pretty significant changes here over the course of the next several months. Probably not within the next couple of months. More than likely, these changes that we're going to talk about today will come to be at the end of this year at the earliest. If not then it's probably going to be next year sometime. But it's worth spending time now understanding how these changes might impact your scores so that you can see exactly what's going to happen to them, and so you can be prepared for them. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's kind of the agenda that I would like to follow. As we go along here, make sure to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll either get to them as we go along, or we'll certainly have some time at the end, hopefully, to answer questions specifically. But here's what I'm planning. I'm going to first talk about kind of the background of the safety measurement system, what it is, how it works. I think it's important we start there to get an understanding of how the system works currently, to make sure you've got a good grasp on that, so that we can better understand what exactly is changing. We'll talk about some of the criticisms about the current system over the years and where that has taken us, particularly with respect to some congressional action. U.S. Congress stepped in, told FMCSA that they had to do something about the system in light of the criticisms it has received. And that brings us to the point we're at now, where FMCSA is now proposing some changes. And then we'll dig in deep to the proposed changes, at least the main ones. I think there are 5 or 6 main changes that are likely to take effect. And then we will end with kind of my outlook on where I see things going over the next several months with the system and with your CSA scores. So without any further ado, let's start with kind of a background of safety measurement system. What is it? How did it come to be? What is it doing? That type of stuff. So SMS, Safety Measurement System, is part of a broader program. Many of you may know this already, so I apologize for kind of getting into it here. But like I said, it's important that we at least have this first kind of foundational understanding of where we're at currently, so that we better understand why things are changing and how exactly they are changing. SMS is part of the broader Compliance Safety Accountability System, CSA. That's why a lot of folks tend to know these as CSA scores. CSA is actually describing a broader system than just scores, but it's just colloquially known as CSA scores, or has come to be known as them. When somebody's talking about CSA scores, what they're actually talking about are SMS scores, Safety Measurement System, which again is part of the broader CSA platform. CSA, the broader system, really describes all of the enforcement tools that are available to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, including things like warning letters, your safety ratings, audits, all of those various tools that they have to enforce their Federal Motor Carrier Safety regulations are all rolled up under CSA. That platform, CSA platform, was first implemented back in 2010, and it's really in existence because the FMCSA, many of you may know, relatively speaking, is a fairly small federal agency, as federal agencies go, even compared to other agencies that fall under the umbrella of the United States Department of Transportation. Under that umbrella, we have other agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration, which is huge in comparison to the FMCSA. The FMCSA, as you know, is the agency that is responsible for regulating the interstate operation of commercial motor vehicles, so highway transportation. I think at the last I saw, at any given moment, FMCSA has about 1,000 employees total. And that group of individuals, 1,000 employees, is in charge of regulating now over 700,000 registered motor carriers in the United States. So they just don't have the manpower to get out and enforce their regulations via audits or anything like that with any significant percentage of the regulated motor carriers. So what they have to do is they have to prioritize motor carriers, the worst performing motor carriers, to escalate for further enforcement, usually in the form of an audit. That is the whole rationale for the CSA platform. Congress stepped in and said, we got to do something because the FMCSA is just not able to adequately enforce the regulations, so we have to figure out a way to prioritize the worst for performing motor carriers. The ways that we do that now are primarily through the CSA platform and specifically through the safety measurement system, which is, in essence, the primary enforcement prioritization tool that the FMCSA uses. It is the way that the FMCSA prioritizes you for fines and audits and things like that. How does it do that? It does it through a scoring system known as the safety measurement system. This SMS system, many of you, again, may know all of this, so apologize for repeating, but it is a system that is gathering a lot of data from different sources, primarily from roadside inspections. As your trucks and as your drivers are out there operating and incurring roadside inspections and violations get written up on the inspection reports, all of that data gets put into the system, safety measurement system, along with data from any audit. So if you happen to undergo a DOT audit and they write you up for violations in that audit, critical and acute violations, those are also populating in the safety measurement system. But primarily the main data source here is the violations that you are incurring during roadside inspections. All of that gets brought into the system and then split out into 7 categories, which are known as the basics, the behavioral analysis safety improvement categories. It's a mouthful. Luckily, we'll talk about later. That's one of the things that's changing. We're getting rid of that acronym. We can just call them safety categories going forward. But all of the violations that you are incurring are getting split up into one of these 7 basics. The 7 basics are listed out here. This may be a screen, hopefully, that is familiar to you if you are a regulated carrier. This is a detailed look at a sample safety measurement system account. These are the 7 basics that you would see if you were to log into your account today. This is how it would look. 7 basics are unsafe driving. Those are going to encompass violations like speeding and lane change violations, failing to comply with traffic control devices. All of those traffic type violations get put into the unsafe driving category. The crash indicator basic is the second one. It encompasses all DOT recordable accidents in which your drivers and trucks are involved, regardless of whether they're your fault or not. They get put into your crash indicator score. There is now a crash preventability determination program that we can get into in a little bit, but suffice it to say, at this point, crash indicator encompasses all of your DOT recordable accidents. The hours of service category is the third one. This is where all of the hours of service violations get put. So your 11-hour violations, your 14-hour violations, 30-minute rest break, false logs, ELD violations, all of those get put on your hours of service basic. Vehicle maintenance is the next one. It is the largest basic of them all, meaning it has the most data in it of them all, which is spurring a proposed change that we'll talk about in a minute. But vehicle maintenance includes all of the maintenance-related defects that you would expect. So brakes, lights, tire problems, all of those, and also cargo securement violations get put on your vehicle maintenance score. Drug and alcohol is the next one, encompasses not necessarily positive drug and alcohol tests. Those aren't the types of things that get put into that category here. This is a category that encompasses on the road drug and alcohol violations if you happen to have them. So if a driver gets a DUI while operating a commercial motor vehicle, or gets stopped and an officer finds drugs or alcohol in the cab of the vehicle, those are the types of violations that get put on your drug and alcohol score. Hazmat, which encompasses all hazmat violations if you happen to haul it, so placarding violations, shipping paper violations, those types of things. And then lastly, driver fitness is the last basic. Driver fitness encompasses driver qualification type violations. So and having the wrong license or having no license, having an expired med card, all of those things that go into qualifying a commercial driver. Anything you get wrong there gets put on your driver fitness score. So that's how it goes. From month to month, the system is bringing in roadside inspection violation data, and it is categorizing it into these 7 basics for every one of the 700,000 plus regulated motor carriers. Then the other things to know about the system is that we have what are called absolute measures and percentile measures. An absolute measure is just describing your scores relative to yourself. So every month you're having new violations maybe put on a particular category, and then the system is calculating your particular absolute measure score in that category in that month. The system is bringing in data for the last 24 months. After 24 months, it no longer impacts your scores, but anything that has happened in these categories over the past 24 months is impacting your absolute measure score. How is an absolute measure score calculated? It is calculated by taking each of those violations. Under the current SMS methodology, each violation, I think there are 950 or so potential violations that can impact your scores. Each one of those is given what's called a severity weight, depending on how serious it is or more likely to cause a crash. If you go in and search for the SMS methodology now, you'll find a several hundred page document. You could just Google this and find it. It details exactly how your scores are currently calculated. It's a document that I've read more than I care to admit, but it's out there if you want to see it. But there, at the end of that document is the entire table of the severity weights that apply to those 950 or so violations on a scale of 1 to 10. The more serious violations are going to carry a heavier severity weight than a more minor violation. An example of a 10-pointer is going to be what the types of violations you would expect to carry the most weight. Using a driver after he or she has tested positive for drugs or alcohol, for example, would be a serious violation. Whereas a form and manner violation on your driver logs, they forget to put the shipping paper number or the trailer number on their log. That's a relatively minor violation. So each of those violations gets a severity weight, and then the violation is multiplied, the severity weight is multiplied by a time weight. Violations that have occurred more recently carry a greater time weight than violations that are older. If it's within the last 6 months, it has a time weight of 3. If it's between 6 and 12 months, it has a time weight of 2. If it's older than a year, between 12 months and 24 months, then it has a time weight of 1. And then after 24 months, it falls off completely. So your severity weight times your times weight equals your total weight for each violation that's in each category, and then those all get added up, whatever those numbers happen to be, and you get an absolute measure. You could see the absolute measure here in this example. It's the top number right under the icons there. You could see unsafe driving. It's a little bit cut off. The measure there, the absolute measure, is 9.5. Does that mean anything to you standing alone? Probably not. What does 9.5 mean? Nothing. It is telling you what your score is on this particular month in that category. What's more interesting and what's more important to you are your percentile scores. We've got absolute measures. Those are specific to me. Your percentile score are what are known as your CSA scores or your SMS scores. Those are telling you how you are performing relative to your peers. Those are your CSA scores. That's what everybody is interested in. How are those calculated? They are essentially calculated by putting every regulated motor carrier in each category in what are called safety event groups. It would be fundamentally unfair if the system were ranking all motor carriers together It would be unfair to have a carrier that has one inspection with a violation in unsafe driving being ranked against a carrier that has hundreds or thousands of violations in that category. It's just not apples to apples. So what the system does currently is it places us in safety event groups that are based primarily on the number of inspections with violations you've had in each of the categories. So you'll be in a safety event group in each of the categories depending on your inspection activity. If you've had 10 inspections with violations in the hours of service basic within the last 24 months, then you're going to be compared against other carriers that have had a similar number of inspections with violations over that time period. And then it puts you on a scale, a percentile scale, based on how you are performing relative to the others with a similar number of inspections with violations. So when you see a percentile score in a basic, for example, this carrier in this example has an 86% score in the unsafe driving category, what that is telling you is that this carrier is performing worse than 86% of its peers in its safety event group as of this month. That is what your percentile score is telling you, how you are performing relative to your peers. So the higher the score, the worse off you are. The other thing to know here is that, aside from just comparing you to your peer groups, the percentile scores are also important from a regulatory standpoint, because the FMCSA has set in each of those categories what are called intervention thresholds. It is a specific percentile score in each of the basics where if you exceed that score in a particular month, you are going to get that nice big warning triangle on your score that we see in this example. The score, the intervention threshold changes based on the type of carrier that you are. There's a separate score for general commodity carriers, there's one for hazmat carriers, and there's one for passenger carriers. So depending on which of those categories you fall in, that dictates what your intervention threshold is going to be in each of the basics. And then from each of the basics, there is a separate score. So for example, the vehicle maintenance intervention threshold for general commodity carriers is currently 80%. So if you're performing worse than 80% on a particular month in the vehicle maintenance category and you're a general commodities carrier, then you're going to have that warning triangle put on your score. The most common intervention thresholds for general commodity carriers are 65% or 80%. So some of the basics are 65%, some of them are 80%. And we'll talk about in a little bit how some of those are going to be changing here soon. But you're trying to avoid that warning triangle at all costs. You're trying to keep your scores below those intervention thresholds in each of the basics, because bad things happen when you exceed the intervention thresholds. It's not just the warning triangle. What does that warning triangle mean? It means you are now prioritized for enforcement from an FMCSA standpoint. So that's what the FMCSA and their enforcement partners, their state law enforcement partners, are looking at to see who should we go in and do an audit. They are looking at carriers that are having trouble, namely those that have basics in the so-called alert status. Now, in my experience, it kind of depends where you happen to be located in the country, but usually it's been my experience that carriers that have one basic in alert status on a given month are not likely to get audited because of that. It's usually carriers that have two or more basics in alert status when I start to become worried about a potential audit or something to that effect. Again, that's not universally true. Sometimes even a single basic in alert status will prompt an audit, but it's when you start to get multiple basics in alert status where the FMCSA really starts to take notice, and then you may get the knock at the door that you don't want to get, where they say it's time to come in and take a look at your records. So just be aware of that. But also, again, we also mentioned at the start some of the others that are looking at your scores, and they are also looking to see, do you have any of these warning triangles on your scores? Namely, your commercial auto liability insurers and also your customers. Those and certainly plaintiffs' attorneys. If you've got any of your basics in alert status, it's going to negatively impact your commercial auto liability insurance premiums, your relationships with your customers potentially, and also, God forbid, you get involved in a catastrophic accident. That is going to come to light in that litigation, and the story that is going to be told to the jury in that case is look at the carrier's scores here. They've got they're performing worse than this percentage of their peers in this category. How can we let them continue operating? We have to punish them for their bad behavior here, and that's what is leading to these multi-million-dollar verdicts that we see in some of these highway accident litigation cases. So,
and Brandon, just a plaintiff's attorney, all they need is a motor carrier number to access that information. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's a good point, Mark. The other thing to know, you may know this already if you've been dealing with SMS for a while, is that for a not for a long time, actually for a very short period of time, these percentile scores that we're showing here were publicly available for anybody to see. That has changed. That changed shortly after FMCSA published the CSA program because of criticisms in the industry, and that's what we're getting into here in a second. FMCSA got a lot of blowback about this scoring system. Folks in the industry concerned about whether the data was reliable and whether it accurately identified motor carriers that were more likely to cause crashes. Because of that criticism, the U.S. Congress got involved and actually directed the FMCSA to remove from public view these percentile scores. So now if you have a DOT number, you can log on and you can get access to all of the underlying data for any regulated motor carrier. What I mean by underlying data, all of the roadside inspection data that is filtering into the system. You can also see their absolute measure scores, but you can't see the percentile scores or these warning triangles for motor carriers for any motor carrier unless you are logging into your own personal account. You have to have a password, essentially, your US DOT PIN number, to see what your actual percentile score is. And then certainly law enforcement has access to your percentile scores. So you're probably asking, well, how do those other groups get access to my scores then to see how I'm performing? Insurance groups get access to your scores either by getting you to provide them your PIN number to log in, or there have come to be third-party platforms out there that do a pretty good job of estimating what your percentile score is. If you hear a lot of talk about CAB reports that insurance groups use, it's essentially a system that is estimating what your percentile score is. And like I said, they're pretty close to accurate. So even though your scores are technically not publicly available, if you're a general commodities carrier, passenger carrier scores are still available to the public. But if you're a general commodities hauler or a hazmat hauler and you don't haul passengers, even though your scores aren't publicly available technically, people can still essentially estimate what they are and get access to them. So that takes us to the industry criticism. What have folks been complaining about the system? Why have they been complaining? And I have been right there with you, complaining about these things for years. There's a lot of problems with the system and whether it does what it claims to do, which is to prioritize the worst offending motor carriers. Does it do a good job of that? Does it do a good job of predicting future crash risk? And a lot of folks have said, no, it doesn't do that. And a lot of studies have suggested that it doesn't do a great job of identifying the highest risk motor carriers for a number of reasons. I've listed a few of them here, including disparate enforcement. This has been a big criticism of the platform for years, where carriers that happen to be situated in particular areas of the country have relatively higher scores than similarly situated carriers in other areas of the country because of the way that certain states enforce their laws. For example, Indiana is notorious for having carriers with the highest unsafe driving scores in the country because Indiana is particularly aggressive when it comes to speeding violations. So if you have a lot of vehicles working through or operating through Indiana, then it's very likely that you have an elevated unsafe driving score compared to carriers that don't have as much Indiana operations. That's not fair because it shouldn't be the places in the country that dictate whether we are an unsafe carrier or not under SMS. So there are things like that that have kind of bubbled to the surface over the years and that have gotten the ear of the U.S. Congress. U.S. Congress steps in 2015 with the FAST Act. Many of you may recall this. This is the act that not only removed from public view the public scores or the percentile scores, but more importantly, directed the FMCSA to commission an independent study of SMS and then to implement any recommendations that that independent study may have proposed. That study took place over the last several years. It was the National Academy of Sciences, NAS, that conducted the study, and they developed a report. They put together a report. Their findings were issued in 2017. Surprisingly to a lot of us in the industry, NASA's main finding was that SMS is quote-unquote conceptually sound. In other words, they didn't tear it apart like we had hoped that they would tear it apart. They found that overall it was conceptually sound. It did note that the system appeared to have some data quality problems, and so they proposed, or they put forth a recommendation that said, even though the system is statistically principled, they would recommend that the FMCSA consider a new model to identify motor carriers that need intervention. And the model that they had proposed was a model called the Item Response Theory, IRT model. You've probably heard this term thrown around. What is it? It's a very complex statistical model that is used in other industries. It's used in standardized testing for like SAT and stuff like that. It's a scoring model that is commonly used in other industries. It's the one that NAS recommended FMCSA consider moving to, away from what they currently have, into an item response theory model. FMCSA over the last couple of years has been piloting an IRT model, but this is the first big takeaway here. FMCSA, in a recent publication that has kind of spurred this discussion that we're having today, has said we are not going to an IRT model. NAS be damned. We don't care what they say. We have studied the model. We don't like the model. They listed out a handful of issues that they had with that model, but my takeaway from their publication recently was that they just thought the model was too complex. It is too hard to understand exactly how scores are calculated using that model. It's way too complex. So they have disposed of the IRT model. We are not moving to an IRT model. Okay, so that takes us to what exactly is changing. What are we doing then if we're not moving to the IRT model that the National Academies of Sciences has recommended? Well, FMCSA is proposing their own changes to their existing system. They are proposing, like I said, a handful of changes to the existing system, not disregarding it completely, not moving to a completely new model. We're going to keep the foundations of the safety measurement system that we have in place now, and we are going to make a handful of tweaks to it to address some of these concerns that have been raised over the years. So let's get into what are these changes. As I said, there are a handful of them that I think are worth mentioning. There's more to it than this. If you're interested in reading the nitty-gritty details of the proposed changes, FMCSA has a pretty good document on this topic, the new methodology. This is on their SMS changes website. They have a specific website, a dedicated website set up for this. And I recommend you check that out. If you haven't already done this, you can actually, if you're a regulated motor carrier, you can log into your current SMS account and click a link and see how your scores will be changing once these proposed changes go into effect. I recommend you do that to see how these are likely to impact you. You could take a look at that now. And if you see problems with it, what's today? Today's the 11th. The comment period for these proposed changes is still open for a few more days, to the 15th, I believe, of May. That may get extended. We'll have to wait and see. But right now, go in, play around in the system. If you see problems, get your comments in so that the FMCSA can review those issues and address them before these proposed changes go into effect. We're in a proposal stage now. As I said at the start, I don't anticipate these changes going into effect anytime in the near future. At earliest, it will probably be the end of this year, if I had to guess, if not next year. All right? So here are the handful of major proposed changes that we're talking about. They are a reorganization of the basics into what are called safety categories, a consolidation of violations into violation groups, simplified severity weights, proportionate percentiles, a modification to the intervention thresholds that we talked about, and a heightened focus on more recent data. We're going to tackle these one by one here. Again, as we go along, feel free to drop some questions in, and we'll get to them. All right, so first up are reorganizing the basics into safety categories. Those 7 basics that I mentioned at the start, that's what we have currently. That is not what we're going to have under these proposed changes. We are still going to have 7 basics, but they're not going to be the same. They are going to be a little bit different. Most of them will be the same, but there will be a few differences. Number 1, the first part of this change is, like I said, a name change. We're not going to call these basics anymore. We are just going to call them safety categories. The next big change when it comes to reorganizing the basics is that the existing drug and alcohol basic that we talked about is going away completely. It is going away. Why? Because that is the basic of the 7 that we have currently where there is the least amount of data in the system. Why is that? It's because, like I said, this basic is not covering things like positive drug and alcohol test. It is covering conduct committed within a commercial motor vehicle, drug and alcohol related, so DUIs and stuff like that. Turns out we're not having that many DUIs in a commercial motor vehicle or drivers with open containers in a commercial motor vehicle. There may be a lot of that going on in personal vehicles, but it turns out there's not a lot of that going on in commercial motor vehicles, thank God. But the point is, because we don't have that much data in that category, many carriers don't even have a score in that category, so it's not telling us all that much. So what are we going to do? We're still going to have those violations. They're just going to be put into the unsafe driving category rather than in a standalone basic. So that's the first big change. The drug and alcohol violations are all going to be consolidated into the unsafe driving category because that's essentially what those violations are. It's an unsafe driving activity to have a driver operating out there impaired. So we're just going to have all of those drug and alcohol violations now impacting your unsafe driving category rather than a standalone basic. All right?
And Brandon, just to make sure the clearinghouse information is completely independent from that.
The Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse is a completely independent system. It is capturing those more typical drug and alcohol violations that we're used to talking about, like actual positive test results and refusals to test and all of that fun stuff. That all gets filtered into the clearinghouse, not into SMS. Okay, so then what else are we talking about when we're talking about reorganizing the basics? We are talking about splitting up that vehicle maintenance basic into 2 separate categories. I mentioned that we're still going to have 7 categories. If we get rid of the drug and alcohol basic, how are we still going to have 7? That leaves us with 6. The reason we're going to still have 7 is because we are proposing to split out the existing vehicle maintenance category into 2 separate categories, and that will take us back up to 7 individual categories. Why are we splitting up vehicle maintenance? FMCSA says we are splitting it up because it is the basic that has the most data in it. We're getting rid of the one that has the least amount of data, and we are splitting up the one that has the most amount of data. Why? We are doing it because, according to FMCSA, because that basic vehicle maintenance has so much data into it, in it, it becomes unwieldy. It becomes hard to determine the root cause of the issues that are causing an elevated vehicle maintenance category. If I've got a high vehicle maintenance score, if we dig in there, we may see hundreds or thousands of vehicle maintenance violations, and it's hard to wrap my mind around what is ultimately contributing to my high vehicle maintenance category. So the FMCSA says we want to make that easier on you to get to the root cause that is causing an elevated vehicle maintenance category. The way we're going to do that is to split up vehicle maintenance into 2 categories, vehicle maintenance and vehicle maintenance driver observed. Vehicle maintenance going forward will be all of the more latent vehicle maintenance related defects, the things that could not be discovered by a driver during a thorough pre-trip inspection, the things that are actually wrong with the mechanics of the vehicle, things that your mechanics should be checking. Those are going to be the violations that get put into the standard vehicle maintenance category. On the other hand, the vehicle maintenance driver observed category are going to be violations that should have or could have been detected by a driver had he or she done a more thorough vehicle inspection. These are going to be typical things like lights and tire tread depth and those types of things that the driver should have caught in a pre-trip inspection. Why? Why are we splitting these up? Because if we have a high driver observed maintenance category, then I know that the root cause of my elevated score in that category is likely a driver inspection issue. My drivers are not doing a thorough enough pre-trip inspection. I need to talk with them. I need to counsel them. I need to train them to conduct more thorough inspections to drive that score down. Versus if I have a high regular vehicle maintenance category, then it's not so much a problem with my drivers. It's more of a problem with the mechanics of my vehicles. And I need to get those in for more thorough, inspections by qualified mechanics and get the mechanical issues taken care of to bring that score down. So that's the idea with splitting these up into two categories, the vehicle maintenance category. All right. Lastly, in terms of reorganizing the basics, all jumping out of service violations will now be in the unsafe driving category. Jumping in out of service is, let's say your driver or your vehicle get placed out of service roadside for a serious violation. If they continue operating that vehicle, flying in the face of that out of service order when they're prohibited from operating, that's a serious violation. That's called jumping in out of service order. Right now, if they jump an out of service order, that jumping an out of service order is a violation in and of itself. If they get caught doing that, you will get tagged with a jumping an out of service order violation. That's a 10-pointer when we talk about severity weights. Where does it get placed, though, on your basics? Right now, it gets placed in the particular basic where the underlying out of service issue was. So if the vehicle was placed out of service for a maintenance problem and then your driver continues operating, that jumping and out of service violation in that case would be placed on your vehicle maintenance category. You'd get hit twice in that maintenance category for that issue. That doesn't make a lot of sense, though, because what we are concerned with when drivers are jumping out of service orders is really the unsafe activity of jumping that out of service order. It is an unsafe driving issue. It is not another maintenance issue. It is the conduct that we are trying to curb is the unsafe driving activity of jumping the out of service order. So what we are going to do now under the proposed changes is move all of the jumping out of service orders under a single basic unsafe driving. So regardless of what the underlying violation that caused the out of service order is, if the driver jumps the out of service order, or if you as the carrier do that, it's going to be put on your unsafe driving category. Hopefully you're not incurring many of those. You don't see them very often, but just know that they're going to be on your unsafe driving category going forward. All right, that's the first big change, reorganization of basics. Second big change are changes to violations. As I said earlier, we have about 950 existing violations in the system, 959 to be exact, that your drivers or your vehicles could be tagged with in a roadside inspection. Right now, under the current system, you can go into your SMS account and you will see those line item by line item, potentially 959 separate violation types. We are still going to have those violation types, those 959. In fact, we're going to be adding 14 more of them. So 970 or whatever that ends up with. We're still going to have the possibility of that many violations, but what we are proposing to do now is to group them into like kinds, into 116 separate violation groups. FMCSA's rationale for this is that determining whether a safety issue is identified is more important than determining how many different ways it is documented. So we are going to fix that issue by grouping like-kind violations into violation groups. And then for scoring purposes, we are only going to score you on the violation groups, not the individual violations that make up those groups. So let's put it this way. When you get a roadside inspection report, you are still going to see all of the individual line item violations. Again, 970 some potentials. But when it comes to putting those into SMS, if there are violations, similar kinds of violations written up on that report that are within a single group, that are like kind, they will now only show up once on your SMS scores. They will only weigh on your score once, because what we want to do is curb the behavior. We care less about how many times, how many ways that behavior was documented via violations. We care more about that there was this particular type of problem, and we're going to punish you for that particular type of problem. This is a little hard to understand conceptually, so let's look at an example here. Let's say your driver is having an hours of service problem. Here's a very likely potential way that you could see them written up in a single roadside inspection. If that driver's having an hours of service problem, then maybe they get written up for all 4 of these individual hours of service violations on the roadside inspection report. 14-hour violation, 11-hour violation, 30-minute rest break violation, and a 70-hour violation. That would be written up as 4 separate violations under the current system, and it would impact you 4 times. Under the current system, your hours of service score would be hit 4 times for that one roadside inspection with all 4 of those violations. But ultimately, what we are concerned with here is that this driver is having an hours of service problem. They don't understand the rules, or they are just, violating them on purpose. So what we are concerned with is curbing that behavior. So under the proposal, all 4 of those violations, because they are like kind, would be grouped together and shown as a single violation group of an hours of service violation. That's what this screen is showing. It doesn't relate to those hours of service violations, but you can see how under the proposed system we would have violation groups. You could see here this lane restriction is the top one here. Maybe this isn't a great example, but maybe there were multiple lane restriction type violations in that particular inspection. Now they are grouped, and you could see that a severity weight is being applied only to that group of violations. If I click that view violations link next to the lane restrictions, it would pop open all of the violations that are factoring into that group, but it's that group as a whole that gets the severity weight, not the individual violations. All right, so that's violation grouping, and again, the purpose is to punish particular behavior. We don't care so much about how many times it's documented on a roadside inspection. Severity weights is the other big change here. This is probably one of the more significant changes that is being proposed, and it has to do with that scale of 1 to 10 that I talked about earlier. Right now we're on a scale of 1 to 10. Going forward, we are not going to have a scale of 1 to 10. Why not? Because the scale of 1 to 10 is very subjective. How did the FMCSA determine what should be a 10-pointer versus a 5-pointer? It literally just had people within the agency say, oh, I think that one's a 10-pointer versus a 5-pointer. It was not data-driven. It was very subjective in nature, and that has been one of the main criticisms of the system as a whole over the years. So FMCSA is proposing to move away from the scale of 1 to 10 to a new scale of either 1 or 2. Those violation groups, you could see this in that previous example, are now going to have a severity weight of either 1 or 2, and that's it. No 1 to 10. So which ones get 1, which ones get a 2? Severity weights of 2 will only be applied to 2 groups of violations. Those that have an out-of-service violation contained within them, and those that involve a driver disqualifying violation. So these are the most serious type violations. If there's an out-of-service violation within a group, within a violation group, then that group will have a severity weight of 2. Or if it has a driver disqualifying violation within it, then the group will have a violation severity weight of 2. What's a driver disqualifying violation? There's a list of them in the safety regulations. These are very serious driver type violations, things like using a cell phone while driving a commercial motor vehicle. There's a list of, I want to say, 10 or so of them in the regulations. There's not many of them, but it's those more serious violation, driver related conduct while operating a commercial motor vehicle that will result in the group having a severity weight of 2. All others will have a severity weight of 1. Okay? Here's FMCSA's rationale again. FMCSA determined that assigning customized weights to all violations was not as important as noting that the violation occurred. This is kind of the theme that we're seeing. It's more important that we punish you for a particular behavior, not punishing you multiple times for the same behavior. All right? All right, that takes us to proportional percentiles. I want to wrap up here quickly because I want to leave some time for questions. This is the most complex change of them all. If you're interested in understanding this more, I recommend you go look at that SMS methodology document that I mentioned, because this involves math, and I am terrible at math, so I'm not even going to pretend to understand how this calculation works. I've got the calculation here on the slides if you're interested. Just know that one of the big problems we had under the current system was we talked about the safety event groups. We had an issue where if you happen to move between safety event groups on a particular month, you could see a significant swing in your scores just by virtue of the fact that you moved between safety event groups, just because now you're being compared against a different subset of motor carriers. And it wasn't fair to have your scores influenced so heavily just by you moving between the event groups. Maybe you only incurred one additional inspection with a violation in a category on a particular month, and that pushed you up to the next safety event group. Well, then you could see your scores swing wildly. All of a sudden, you were doing fine. Now all of a sudden your scores are over the alert threshold. That was a big problem. So the FMCSA is proposing to deal with that and to eliminate that problem by moving to a proportionate percentile score, where now going forward your percentile score will not be influenced by just moving between safety event groups. It accomplishes this by looking more at a benchmark percentile score. You can see here the process here at the bottom. Safety event groups used, your safety event group will only be used now to calculate a benchmark median percentile for each group annually, and then your percentile score will be a weighted average of percentiles based on those benchmarks. Does this mean anything to anybody that I'm talking to? Again, there's math involved. I'm not going to pretend to understand it precisely. Here's the calculation. Just know that what this is doing is trying to prevent those big swings in your score based on your movement between safety event groups. Okay. I think it's okay. Last two here. Changes to intervention thresholds. We talked about how there are now the intervention thresholds for each of the basics. We're still going to have that, and they are all going to largely remain the same. We're still going to have the separate ones for passenger carriers, hazmat carriers, and general commodity carriers, and they're still going to all be different across the different basics. Most of them will remain the same. For example, if you look at the general commodity carrier threshold, right now I mentioned that the most common thresholds are 65% and 80%. Some of those are going to be changing a little bit. The ones that are changing are going to be the hazmat basic and the driver fitness basics. Those two intervention thresholds are going up. You could see that for general commodity carriers, the current intervention threshold for hazmat compliance and driver fitness is 80%, but you could see the proposal is that will be moving up 10 percentage points to 90%. So we are tightening our focus in on those particular categories. We are only looking at a smaller group of the worst performing motor carriers than we were under the current system. Why is that? Because of all of the basics, hazmat compliance and driver fitness, it turns out, have the least correlation to future crash risk. In fact, some of the data out there suggests that driver fitness category has an inverse relationship to crash risk. Believe it or not. The higher your score in driver fitness, the less likely you are to be involved in a crash. It was just crazy. So that was one of the big criticisms. So the way that the FMCSA is proposing to handle that is by placing less of an emphasis on those two categories. The way that it does that is by raising the intervention threshold in those two categories up from where they were. Lastly, a heightened focus on more recent data. Currently, as I said, SMS brings in data from the last 24 months of roadside inspections. It's still going to bring in that amount of data. We're still going to have a look-back period of 24 months. But going forward, the system will only give you a score in one of those basics if you have had inspection data in that basic within the last 12 months. In other words, if your only inspection data in a particular basic occurred a long time ago, meaning you've cleaned things up in that basic, if it happened longer than 12 months ago, then you're going to have no score in that basic whatsoever. So the data has to be recent for you to even get a score in a particular basic. If you have violation data in a basic in the last 12 months, then you will very likely have a score in that basic. But if your only inspection data in a particular basic is older than 12 months, you will no longer have a score in that basic, giving you some credit for the changes that you've made to fix the issue over the last year. All right? That was a lot to get through in a little amount of time. My outlook on this is, like I said, I expect these changes will take effect later this year at the earliest. You could preview your scores. You should preview your scores at that website. You can just Google FMCSA CSA prioritization preview, and it will come up. We've got detailed articles on it on our website if you're interested in a lot of content on it. I spent like 2 hours on one of our own webinars breaking this down, so if you're interested, check that out. My big concern here is, overall, I'm a fan of these changes because I think they go a long way to address some of the problems that we've had with the system over the years. What I'm concerned about is that FMCSA thinks that these changes fix all of the issues, and I'm worried that their next step may be to say, we have fixed all of the problems, so now we are going to tie a motor carrier's safety rating to their SMS scores, which has not been a thing to this point. Your safety rating, you only get a safety rating if you go through an audit, which provides some procedural protections to you. You can appeal audit findings, for example. I'm worried that FMCSA may think that their changes to SMS that they're proposing here are sufficient enough to say, now we're going to tie your safety rating to your CSA scores. To be clear, they haven't proposed that. But what we know is that changes to the safety rating process are on the docket for the FMCSA to consider later this year. I'm worried that that's where this thing may be trending, but we'll just have to wait and see. So that's my outlook on it. I haven't left as much time as I wanted to for questions, but we got a few minutes here.
Okay, wow, that's a lot of stuff. Drug and alcohol is moving over to unsafe. Maintenance is busted out into I'm gonna call pre-trip violations and non-pre-trip violations, grouping violations. Instead of having severity weights of 4 and 7 and 6.2, it's just going to be either 1 or 2. Is that
That's
right?
Yep, 1 or 2.
And those are out of service. Obviously, the severe stuff is going to be the 2.
Yeah, it's basically out of service violations are going to get the 2, and then all other violations, violation groups, assuming they don't have an out of service violation, are going to be 1. That's the easiest way to think of it.
Going to tweak the thresholds a little bit. Looks like hazmat got a little relief there.
Hazmat and driver fitness both went up about 10 percentage points.
And I like to try to explain that proportional mathematics. I'm just going to say it's more of a bell curve. Is that a better? Is that a? It's got to kind of.
That sounds good. I don't know if that's what the math plays out, but yeah, if you're interested in that, check out the methodology document.
Okay. Well, I know we're running close on time. I got a lot. I know Raul had a lot of questions on data queue, which is a whole nother thing. Data queue is, I can speak for CVSA. They want to get it right. They understand mistakes are made. The data queue system does work. We had a whole webinar on data queue with CVSA. It was about a year ago. We probably need to do another one. Are there any changes to the data queue system here, Brandon?
Not yet. And so FMCSA has had some listening sessions on these proposed SMS changes that I've attended, and I've asked the question, how's this going to impact data queues, particularly when you have an adjudicated citation? Right now, folks who know the system know that if you have a driver who gets convicted of a different charge, in other words, they've had a state court convict them of a different charge than what they were originally cited for, you can file a data queue appeal, and you can get the severity weight of that violation dropped down to 1. That's how the system works now. My point to FMCSA was, well, how does that impact data queue? Because now the severity weight in most cases is always going to be 1. So it does me no good to file a data queue for an adjudicated citation because dropping down to 1 does me no good. And they have said they recognize that fact. Yeah, that's not going to do you any good. The point is, the next phase of these proposed changes, as I understand it, is that once FMCSA reviews all of the comments, the next phase is for them to do a deep dive analysis of how these changes may impact their other systems, including data queues, including pre-employment screening program, and then they will make any necessary tweaks that they deem appropriate based on that review. So we just have to wait and see.
And I don't want to, your observation overall is favorable for these changes, Brandon?
I like these changes. Again, they address a lot of the problems we've had, I think, but I'm going to reserve judgment until I see how it plays out for a few more carriers, because I'm concerned that some things are still not addressed very well. So I don't think it goes all the way. It doesn't take us all the way to fixing all of the problems, but it does do a lot to fix a lot of the major problems that we've had with it.
Yes, and you hear a little bird chirping in the background that there's a possibility of a safety rating linked to the safety measurement system.
Nobody has told me that. The agency hasn't said that, but I know from looking at their docket of their agenda, their regulatory agenda, that safety ratings are on the schedule to address. And we know from previous years where FMCSA has proposed to tie a carrier safety rating to their CSA scores, that one that was proposed probably 6 or 7 years ago got shot down. It would not surprise me at all if they try and revisit that now, claiming that they have fixed the SMS program.
Well, I would just make a comment on that. ELDs were going to solve the fatigue problem. So we'll see how that goes. But I know we're running out of time. We're at our 1 hour. We're going to answer these questions. I think most of them are around the data queue. We appreciate that. That's a whole nother webinar. It does work. I will attest CVSA wants the right information. They understand mistakes are made, and a disciplined approach to a data queue is very satisfactory. It works very well. So I won't get into that in detail right now. We got Brandon's comments contact right here. I encourage you. He's a voice for our industry. Please support his voice. Here's his contact information. And I also wanted to give one more opportunity to sign up for the free demonstration, and also restate that there's a hot, right off the topic, right off the table, ABS content that we've done. We'll send that with the follow-up email. I encourage you, if you're not a subscriber, the timing is right to get on a demo, get some content out. We've got International Road Check next week. Is that right, Brandon?
Next week. Better be ready for it.
There are going to be many populated, good and bad roadside inspections next week, and well, we want you to be prepared for that. Brandon, thank you again. We appreciate very much you supporting Infinity Workforce Solutions and our clients, and more important, our industry, as these changes will do a lot to improve highway safety.
Thanks so much, Mark. Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.